Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2019 OWHE webinar series. My name is Cherise Bunn, and I am the Director of Education. And I will be talking to you today about Advocacy 101. I've been the Director of Education for the last 2 years, and it's been great. So I'm excited to share this with all of you. So before I actually start talking about advocacy, I wanted to share a couple opportunities for you. So as the Director of Education, I just wanted to let you know that there are many ways to get involved with OWHE outside of the annual conference, which was this last weekend. So one thing is to propose or listen to a webinar, which some of you are doing right now. Second part would be to write for OWHE or just to read the blog. And I challenge anyone who reads the blog to email one of the writers. At the bottom of every blog post, there is a the email address and contact information of the person who wrote. And just as a writer too, it feels really good to have people respond to what you share. So I think that would be a great challenge and a way that you could connect outside the conference. I also wanted to share that we have the Dear OWHE initiative, which allows you to ask questions for the OWHE board about working in higher education, and the board of directors will take turns answering those questions. I also wanted to share with you the OWHE book club. We already have 12 books selected for 2019. So you could gather together with friends, colleagues, and read the books and then talk about them and see what you've learned. I also wanted to share with you that the OWHE 2019 webinar series is shaping up quite well. On March 1st, we actually have a webinar about the board of directors, so what it means to run for the board of directors and hear about the different positions that are open. In April, we do have a webinar coming out, which I will be announcing soon, so pay attention for that one. In May, the date is still to be decided, but we have code switching in the workplace with Damian Lucas. In June, we have job crafting with Alex Algetz. In August, we have squad goals with Alicia and Tiffany from SOU. In October, we have practicing civil discourse in uncivil times with Linda and Debbie from George Fox. And then in November, we have Sorry Not Sorry, using language to maintain authority with Ashley. So these, many of these were actually presentations at the conference, and we're sharing them with you afterwards. So that's going to be a great way for folks, especially who weren't able to attend the conference. So with that, I actually wanted to get to the purpose of why we're here today. So we're talking about Advocacy 101, supporting a cause to create change. And so I actually wanted to give everyone an opportunity to take a moment to pull out your phones and tweet a message. Use the hashtag #IAdvocate4 and write about what you advocate for. What's your mission? What are you working towards? Thoughts on that. Please, you can tag OWHE at OWHE or Oregon WHE and use the hashtag OWHE Education. So I'll give just a second for this. This is the time in the presentation. Usually you would, if you were in a room together, everybody would share that. So you could also share that if you're sitting in a room together. So this morning I did this too before the webinar started, and I used the hashtag I advocate for a world where people have a right of dignity and respect. Hashtag OWHE Education. So that's kind of a lot of why I do, what I care about. So today in this webinar, we're going to hopefully identify some tangible ways to incorporate advocacy into our daily lives, both inside and outside of work, and to also create personal goals for advocacy in and for advocacy in and outside of work. So a quick introduction, I wanted to share a little bit about myself. So I'm an international student advisor at the University of Oregon. I've been the OWHE Director of Education from 2017 to this year. And I've been NAFSA Region 1's advocacy representative for the past year and a quarter, I guess I would say. So one of the reasons there's a picture of me at the county fair in Yamhill County is actually to talk about when I first started seeing myself as an advocate. So the picture on the left is actually of me as a young girl. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my dad was telling a story about work. So my dad was in the military, and he was arguing with his boss, the general of the military department, about taking time off to be with our family. Because my dad was good at his job, his boss didn't want him to take off during that point in the summer. So as he said this, I actually spoke up at the middle of the dinner table, and I said, "That's not fair. I'm going to write the general a letter." And my whole family laughed at me, which I didn't quite get, but everybody's like, "That's sweet, that's cute." Not only because I was this little girl with pigtails and bad handwriting, but also just the fact that I was so passionate for justice that I was going to stand up for my dad. The idea of writing a letter to show my how I was upset was actually inspired by my mother, who would always write letters to dispute insurance claims, report bad business practices to the Better Business Bureau, or even to stand up for certain policies that had been in the family business to show how they weren't pleased with how things were going. So it was something, and I have to admit that this is largely tied to my culture as a white person. I know that it's part of my culture and part of white culture to feel more comfortable standing up than some folks may naturally due to cultural expectations. But I just want to note, like, that's definitely how I have been raised and have grown up, and part of why I do what I do. So I want you to take a second, and if you are in a room with people, share this. Who are you? Why did you want to listen to this webinar today, and why advocacy? If anybody actually would like to share in the chat box, please feel free to do that as well. I hope you had a brief chance to share about why you're here in the room, why you're interested in advocacy. I think, I guess I would say for me, one of the reasons I'm so interested in advocacy is because I've seen the ability we have to make change through advocacy work, and I really believe in advocating for change. So I wanted to go to, oh, hold on, I wanted to go back. So some people did comment. And so one person, Jess, welcome, said she wanted some structure on advocacy as a new concept for yourself. Awesome. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ways to advocate and create structure for yourself. Morgan said she's an academic advisor for online students at Portland Community College, new to the role and want to learn some skills to not only learn how to advocate for online students, but for students of all identities. That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. So I wanted to be clear, as much as I consider myself an advocate, and it's something that I'm starting to get known for in my different circles, I believe that advocacy is something that we continue to build skills for, and it's something that you're never perfect with, but it's something that we can all do in different ways. And so this slide here is just about, so advocacy is a really big word. So I have done this presentations a few times in different settings, and each time when I get ready, I realize that I have to over prepare a little bit, because it's always, there's so much to talk about with advocacy. So I think there's a lot of different ways to advocate. There's some of the pitfalls of advocacy and what we're looking to do. And I've even spoken a lot with my different mentors about, so what does this mean for you to advocate? How do you advocate within your role? And so in this session, I really want everyone to be able to take away something that you can work on. So please be thinking that in the back of your mind, like, what are you hoping to leave with? Or what can you do with what I'm going to share today? So I actually wanted to go here and talk about some burning questions. So first of all, if you have any burning questions about advocacy, I would encourage you to type them into the chat box right now. I'm going to share, while you have a chance to do that, hopefully someone's able to, I'm just going to share with you, we're going to go through some of the burning questions that a lot of people have about advocacy, and I'll share those with you. And then I'm going to go through two of the most kind of, advocacy 101 sort of questions that I would hope would be helpful and useful to all of you. So since nobody shared in the chat box, which is totally fine, I wanted to get to some of the burning questions about advocacy. So oh, thank you. Okay, good. So somebody did speak right in the chat box and said that one of their big questions about advocacy is knowing when it's your place to advocate and when I'm not the right person to be advocating. That's a really good question. In different sessions when I've shared this with people or I've talked to people, we've gone through all these lists that are all these questions that are up here. So I'm just going to read through a couple of them. One question is like, there's so much to advocate for. Where do I start? Some people are really similar to that first question. People are like, well, which is better to start with, the global, national, or the local? What's the most effective place to put in time and energy? How will I know if any advocacy I'm doing will help make any type of change? How can I advocate for individuals with different identities without making assumptions that may be damaging? People wanting to know about advocacy at different types of institutions. One of the questions I really like on here, what can an introvert do to advocate for a cause? What can my office or I as an individual do to advocate for change? And so these are all great questions. And I'm just going to be clear with you. A lot of these questions are things that we all have to figure out for ourselves individually. And so hopefully as we work through today, we all have kind of an opportunity to reflect on this and talk about, and hopefully you have some things to take away of, this is how I'm going to answer this question for myself. So I wanted to share my two main questions, and these are ones that I have talked to people about, have consulted on. And the first one is, how do you get started? And the second one, how do you keep motivated to keep going when the work is never ending? So there is this phrase, advocacy is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And I think one thing, and I think this speaks to my privilege as a white person, is that every once in a while I have, and specifically when I was a lot younger, I was always hoping for a fix, like a quick fix, or like, oh my gosh, this is a huge deal. Like, how are we going to change this? And how are we going to do that today? And I think the reality of advocacy is that you have to be able to take small steps in order to get anywhere, even to move the needle like a fourth of a degree. So with regards to these questions, I'm going to start with the idea of engaging with reality. So the biggest thing for me is actually to be able to engage with the reality of the world we live in. For me, this means getting informed and stepping into the now. I believe that there are several factors that keep us from taking action, such as lack of motivation, fear, confusion, and sometimes even anger. I'll be honest with you, when it comes to some of what we're advocating for and some of what's happening in society and at my institution even, I get angry. And one thing is that I just realized I can't step back, and I can't get, I feel like when we do step back, we start to do things that are more harmful. And so I really like MLK's quote from a letter from Birmingham City Jail, which is actually his best work. I would say read that. It's the best thing. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about with regards to advocacy is sometimes we step back, or things just seem so overwhelming that it's like, I can't talk about this right now. Or you're at a dinner table with a bunch of your friends or something, and somebody says something that's quite just straight up racist, and realizing that you've been friends with that person for 20 years, and it's like, no, I can't do anything about this. And the reality is, for me, is that by not doing something, you are perpetuating so much of the racism that's permeating our society. So it's really important to be able to speak up. I've heard, I'm going to go back to this for a second. I've heard people cut off from the news. I would say I'm even a person who, a few years ago, ended up deleting a bunch of people from Facebook, etc., just due to trying to limit my interactions with folks that I didn't find were great for me to talk to. But I realized through this process that we can't really shut off the world. When we do, we become part of the problem and rather than the solution. And so I know it's difficult, frustrating, and exhausting, but we really can't shut down. If we care about advocacy work, we have to keep going. And so one of the most inspiring quotes that I look at and read about advocacy is with regards to race. So Beverly Daniel Tatum wrote in her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together at the Cafeteria, which was one of the 2018 OWHE book reads. But she wrote this: I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of white supremacy and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around, unwilling to go to the same destination as the white supremacists. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. And this, for me, it speaks so much of my work in higher education, my work with international students, and just my work as a human being living in society. If we're not actively standing up to what is wrong and what is hurting people and what is taking away people's humanity, we are actually essentially taking away those people's humanity by allowing things to continue and by not speaking up and challenging what's happening. When we disengage, we're ultimately we should be taking responsibility for what's happening, because we're disengaging. We're saying that we don't care, and advocacy for me is largely about caring. So the second thing I want to talk about is finding your voice and taking action. So for me, this is the fun stuff. So, and also the thing that terrifies me. So if you have ever been in a meeting where somebody's talking about something and your stomach starts to churn, like you didn't drink milk, you didn't have kefir or whatever, you were just kind of like sitting there, and suddenly you start to have this like rotten feeling in the stomach and your heart starts to race a lot, you're super nervous and you totally disagree with what's being said in the meeting. Has anybody had this feeling? I'm just curious. I've definitely had it before. When that is happening, it's a sign to take action. I can recall I was at Oregon State University as a graduate student in a meeting where my GTF was, and I had that feeling, and I was so nervous and so upset because I'd never spoken up in a meeting because I wasn't in a setting where people necessarily valued what was being said by graduate students. And I remember that first time taking that step and how terrified I was and how I almost cried. And yet if I hadn't taken that first step, I would not be where I am today, because I never would have felt comfortable enough to speak up to the white man that was speaking to me, saying those different things. So anyway, I just think when you have that feeling, that's really a time to take action. Sometimes we have that feeling and we think about things and we don't take action. Sometimes also we have colleagues speak about a situation, challenging a policy that's happening that's maybe not supporting students. And we might agree with a colleague saying, and we're not also speaking up and supporting that. And I wanted to address that as well. At the OWHE conference this past weekend, I went to the lightning talks and heard Amber Buck talk about the darker side of empathy. So she shared about the emails she gets from colleagues who respond to her speaking out in a meeting. So Amber, for example, will speak up or challenge something that's been said or an idea or a policy, and nobody says anything. Nobody backs her up. But afterwards, people send emails that start with, "I was on your side today when." I can relate to this because I tend to be the person in meetings these days who speaks up all the time. I will always advocate for students and for social justice and equity. And I will go on walks with colleagues or talk to people afterwards, and they'll be like, "I really agreed with you when you said that." And it's something where it would be so much better if people would actually also advocate with you, if you can join and become partners. So that might not seem like, it might sometimes be where you don't feel comfortable speaking up yourself at the beginning initially, but I think if you want to take that step eventually, I think being able to back up your colleagues and advocate in that way as well, I think is huge. Finding your voice is just key to advocating. You have to be able to figure out how you're going to communicate. So anyway, I really believe there's different ways to do this. So I wanted to address the idea of my voice in my space. So both at work and at home, there's ways to advocate. And one thing I say is interrupt exclusive language. So we talk a lot about inclusive language. And one thing I've noticed, because some of what I'm advocating for is people have a misunderstanding of, international students and what that means, or different things. And so I wouldn't say that it's always inclusive language that I'm working with, but sometimes I'm definitely challenging stereotypes. So this notion, that all international students are hoping to just move to the United States, or all Chinese students are rich. And being able to interrupt that both in the workplace, so at the University of Oregon, with the different folks, and also being able to interrupt that idea when I'm meeting with cousins or aunts and uncles or friends. And being able to say, actually, that's not the truth. That's a single story. Maybe that was one student, but that's definitely not all students. A good way, rather than calling somebody out, is sometimes asking people, what do you mean by that? I think sometimes people are talking about different things, and being able to say, what do you mean by that? Makes people reflect on, oh, did I just say something? What does that word even stem from? A lot of our language is actually very exclusive and problematic. And I think being able to ask that question is important. Discuss the issues that concern you. So one thing, I'm sure that, so several of my friends and I talk about the idea of Thanksgiving, going home to see family or friends, and realizing how different life may be because of where we work or what we care about. That's different than maybe what our upbringing was. And it's very important to be able to discuss issues and be able to have conversations. I think share learning which explains and reaches your audience is also important. So sometimes reading articles, sometimes I'm a book person, so sharing a book club, where we're actually able to talk about some of the issues, I think is one way that I'm able to have more meaningful conversations with people, essentially to advocate for students and identities in a way that it doesn't happen otherwise. One of my favorite books is Everything I Never Told You, which is the May book club read this year. And by reading that book with some of my family members and other friends, we were able to have discussions about whiteness and racism in the United States, and sort of whitewashing and all these different things that would not have come up had we not read that book, had they not been able to relate to the characters within that novel. And I think, seriously, for me, the best conversations and advocacy related conversations I have with people sometimes have to do with novels, which is interesting. Another thing that's really important is to keep the flame alive. So motivation, making sure you're taking care of yourself, is really important. Another thing, advocacy, again, is a marathon. I've never run a marathon, but it sounds horrible. And I just would want to, with advocacy, you have to avoid burnout. You have to make sure you've trained, make sure you've taken care of yourself so that you can keep going. In advocacy work, burnout is real. If you ever see someone in your office who started out all excited in their jobs, and then they realized they didn't have the power to do anything and they got dejected, you understand this to some degree. It is really important in advocacy work to find ways to take care of yourself and really keep going. One thing that I do to keep the flame alive is finding inspiration. So one of the people I admire most in the world is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, also known as the notorious RBG. For those of you who might not be as aware of RBG's legacy, she's known for her fabulous dissenting opinions, which for me at least solidify the idea of resistance and some advocacy. So she sits on the Supreme Court and has actually done so much for our country with regards to women's rights. And as a part of the Supreme Court, where there are 9 judges, sometimes what she's advocating for or what she would vote on fails. Like she doesn't get to, like, the law is not a way that's advocating or allowing certain people, I guess, to have equity and privilege or different things. So when she's part of the dissenting opinion, she says that she's dejected, but only momentarily. When I can't get the 5th vote for something I think is very important. But then you go on to the next challenge and you give it your all. You know that these important issues are not going to go away. They are going to come back again and again. There'll be another time, another day. So, the reality of kind of the United States and our legal system and our laws is that there's a lot of repeats and a lot of things. If you listen to the State of the Union yesterday, you'll know that some things, some directions people are trying to take us back in time in some ways to a different legal system. And I think realizing that we're just gonna have to keep going. I think as an advocate, I can't get dejected and I can't sit down and decide to be sad all the time. That doesn't work, because if I'm going to do that, then I'm going to let them win. It's being ready to continue to fight and to continue to challenge and to continue to advocate for the cause. Another piece, so we're going to get into some more of the burning questions about advocacy and kind of goal setting. But I wanted to talk a little bit about self-advocacy. So for me, a very important aspect of life for all advocates is self-advocacy. I'm not even kidding. This is very real. We have to learn how to self-advocate. If we cannot believe in ourselves and our worth enough to advocate for ourselves, how are we preparing ourselves to advocate for others? So I talk to students a lot about self-advocacy and try to it's something for me even as simple as, let's say a student gets a grade on a paper and they don't understand, or the paper, let's say the grade does not reflect everything that was on the syllabus. And if the student, and I work with international students where there's lots of cultural barriers and sometimes language barriers, and if the student doesn't speak up for themselves or self-advocate, like they might just have to keep that grade, even if it's clear in the syllabus and everything that there's a mismatch. And I'm not the kind of advisor that always steps in and emails a professor. In fact, I rarely would do that. But it's something where I have real conversations with students about self-advocacy, and I talk about how terrifying it is to go to a professor's office. First time I went to a professor's office, I almost started crying because I was actually going because of a grade and I was disappointed. And I had that same sort of feeling I had in my stomach about what was going on, and how I didn't feel like everything was clear. And that feeling eventually went away, but I learned how to speak with people and how to advocate for myself and be able to share how I'm feeling about different things. So at this point, I'm actually going to start talking a little bit about the burning questions. And so the burning questions I shared at the beginning are really based on what people in other presentations have asked about advocacy. So those are actually things people wrote down. So these are some of my tips for those burning questions. The first thing I say, start with one thing. People ask, like, where do you start? It's that question of global, national, local. What do I do? Like, there's so much going on in the world and there's so many people harmed. Like, how do I advocate for everyone? To advocate, you have to start somewhere. So start with one thing. My addition to this, I said, perhaps pick what is most salient to you, or that which affects your life or work. So I mean, one thing I think about a lot is, in my role, so much of being an international student advisor is advocating for international students and advocating for international student space, voice, culture. And I think that I have ample opportunities all the time to advocate for that. But I think sometimes it has to do with, like, what's happening in your neighborhood. So what's happening in your neighborhood to your kids, to your friends' kids, to your to your streets and figuring out how you can advocate for what you need or what you're seeing within your community. Another thing, so people have asked the question about like about advocating and like how do you make sure you're advocating for people like in marginalized communities or for minorities and different things like that. And I would say, this is just from Charisse to y'all, but I would say learn to become an ally for individuals with marginalized identities. Allyship is different than advocacy, but I think if you learn to become an ally and you know what that means, that can help you with future advocacy for these neighbors. So it's not always, I think for me, a lot of what I've learned from allyship and I have empathy as one of my strengths, is trying to better understand and support folks who have been historically marginalized and continue to be. It's not just historical, it's happening today. And I think learning how to be an ally is going to make you such a better advocate in the future. But it's important to be able to be there and to listen and to actually be somebody who's going to eventually stand up with those people and be able to make change. I think another thing is the big one for burning questions. You have to accept the long-term reality of advocacy work. This idea of, like, how do I know what to do? How can I tell if I'm making a change? Quite frankly, sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we don't know if what we're advocating for, if it's going to be good for today, if we're going to win today, and 3 years down the road, you're going to have a different legislator or politician that's in power that's going to completely change what we've advocated for. And so I think the reality is that we have to be able to accept that long-term engagement and long-term advocacy. A suggestion I have for everybody is brainstorm with your team or your person on how to begin your advocacy. So usually when I'm talking about advocacy and when I've done this presentation in the past, a lot of what happens in the room is that people are talking to one another and asking these burning questions and answering these burning questions and talking about, okay, so this is the situation, this is my question, like how can I do something about this? Like what should I do? And I'm a brainstormer and it works. So talking to somebody and using a whiteboard or using a piece of paper and making it's not a brain cloud, but making one of those spider web things, and just trying to figure out like what your advocacy can look like. I said that like my work is largely advocacy based, and I really enjoy that myself, but not everybody has advocacy as part of their role all the time. I would say that most of us, it does show up in different ways, but I would definitely say, working with your team and figuring out how can we advocate for this is super important. So I'm going to talk briefly about further involvement for advocacy. So I would say there's lots of things to try. So on the individual level, I apologize, there's financial support for a cause. So one thing I realize, people ask that question about what can introverts do to advocate, and this isn't just for introverts, this is for everyone. Finding something that you are passionate about and you care about, and figuring out how to show your financial support for that, in whatever means that ends up being. Another thing that I think is really great practice, and I personally want to do, is to research and write op-eds. So be able to write an op-ed about what's going on, what you just read, what you just heard, what's happening at your campus, those different things. So that's something you can do. Calling senators and representatives. So this is actually a very simple thing to do. So as voting, of course, is a very big thing, and I would say everybody should vote who's able and eligible to vote. But once you vote, I would say realize that those people that are in the positions of power, they owe you. They owe all of us. They're not just there, and they shouldn't just be making decisions based on whatever they feel like and whatever they think. They represent the people. And so it is your job, it is our jobs, it is our responsibility to be able to hold them accountable. And calling senators and representatives is great. Many representatives and senators do town hall meetings, and if there's one in your county, I would highly encourage you to go to one. A lot of it might end up feeling a bit like speeches, or it might, they're very practiced in what they're saying. So when I've gone to those in the past, sometimes when they answer questions, I can tell there's very political questions. Maybe it's less authentic than I would appreciate, but at the same time, like, it is important to speak up and to connect to people. I would say another individual level is having lunch with advocates on your campus. So working with your colleagues, your friends, and just learning from one another and trying to work. The last one for individual is what I've been talking about continually. So speaking up in meetings. This is so important. And for me, I mean, and granted, I'm an extrovert and I'm loud and I don't care as much about, making people mad anymore, because I've learned how to communicate better and I've learned how to navigate some of the challenges that come up with speaking up in meetings. But it is so important. Speak up. Share your opinion. And sometimes speaking up means asking a question. Sometimes it's asking a question in a non-threatening way. There's a lot of ways to adapt how you're speaking and how you are challenging things in meetings, but it's definitely worth a try. If you're looking for local groups, so let's say you work on a college campus and it's like, okay, I have these personal limits and limitations and I don't talk to people about all these different things. I think a big thing to do would be to connect on Facebook. So Facebook is still a very popular thing. People can, a lot of groups organize there. Here in Oregon, there's tons of networks. One of the first things that I got involved with was the Women's March 2016. And from there, so many different, Pantsuit Nation, all these different things you can get connected to. I'd also say advocacy threads. So depending on what sort of listservs you're on, there can be specific advocacy threads you can join. Go to events, go to marches. One thing that happened in January and happens every January is the MLK March in different cities. And I would say that's a great place to go and network and meet people and get connected. Another one I would say would be action items. When you have specific action items that, groups give you or invite you to do, like send this letter to these people, do this, do it, just try. Within an institution or a department. So I work in international advising. So we work a lot with regulations or guidance, but when different regulations or guidance come out that relate to your work, comment. So one thing that comes to mind that is more relevant to most women in higher education would be like the new, guidance from the Department of Education on Title IX, and things were out for public comment. And that is a great way to be able to share your thoughts on what they're doing. When laws are unjust, sue or work to change them. There's a lot of institutions I learned, like in Washington State and different places, that have been really involved in challenging certain policies that have come up. And I would say learn what your institution is doing and see if you can figure out how to support that, or at least know what they're doing. When department policies are actually disadvantaging students, change them. So if you work in an office where your office is the department that created the policy, if it's not working for students, seriously, change it. Just because you did something for 15 years doesn't mean that you have to do it for 20 years. Like, you did it for 15 years, great. 5 years, change. So I think challenging those sort of policies is really important, especially when you're getting feedback from students that it doesn't work for them. Another thing I would say, through professional organizations. So I'm in international education. And if you're actually interested at all in immigration things and what's happening with immigration policies in the US, this is actually relevant to anybody who's interested in border issues. NAFSA is Connecting Our World. So if you just Googled that, you could find this, and they give you actionable items of speaking up for dreamers and doing different things, trying to get people to sign letters and do actually take action on immigration. NASPA's policy and advocacy. So NASPA is a pretty popular organization for higher education, and there's definitely a whole slew of things you can do through NASPA or learn about or get involved with. And then in OWHE, I would say volunteer. So you can volunteer in so many different ways. And right now at the conference, we talked about the question of like looking at how inclusive our organization is, and if it's a place where every person of all identities is actually welcome and celebrated. I think it would be a great way to get involved and advocate for a more inclusive space. So with that, I'd actually like to go to the personal challenge. So I've talked a lot about different, I guess, the burning questions, different pieces of advocacy. And I would say and ask all of you, what is a personal challenge you have with regards to advocacy that you would like to work towards in the next 2 months? So 2 months from now would be February, March, April 6th. So I would actually love it if all of you would write down something and email me today. A personal challenge you have with regards to advocacy that you would like to work towards in the next 2 months. And email education@owe.org. And I'll email you back in April. And I would like to see how you work towards it. One thing I've learned about advocacy is that you cannot do it alone. If you ever try to feel like you're trying to take on the world or you're trying to make changes by yourself, it's disheartening and it's really hard, and it quite frankly just doesn't work. So I would love to be somebody that you connect to and just talk about what you're hoping to do and what you're working towards. So please email me. I would love to have that with you. And with that, I actually want to say thank you. So I know that Advocacy 101 is a pretty basic sort of webinar about what it means to advocate and how to stick it out and how to be involved and engaged. And I would just encourage you to keep going at it and keep trying. So if anybody has any questions, please type them into the questions box. Again, I would actually like to go back to the idea of some of your advocacy questions. Some of your very best tools are your people. And I would say if you have people that you trust and that you care about and that have similar values to you, connect and talk about what you're doing and talk about how you can advocate better. And we have a network of advocates within OWHE, so please get involved. But with that, any questions? Okay. So Morgan asked, are there any resources you have found to be useful to help you not only find your voice, but also have good research and information, websites, books, videos, etc.? Yeah, so I think that's a good question. So this is I guess personally to me, some of what has been really inspiring to me, I did share parts of. So I've gotten really into reading certain biographies of different individuals and learning about their experience and struggles to, I guess, become who they are and find their voice. So I'm not trying to repeat something I've already said, but I really, really like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I started by reading Notorious RBG, and then I read My Own Words and Watching on the Basis of Sex. I think those, she's one of my inspirations, and seeing a struggle of such a powerful person who I have so much respect for, seeing the way it's portrayed and sort of how human it is to, I guess, find your voice and feel like you can speak up and start to advocate, I would highly recommend those. On the Basis of Sex, there's this certain portion where, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg's a professor at Rutgers, and her daughter's kind of making fun of her, like, you're not doing anything. Like, how are you even, like, all this is happening, you're not doing anything. And again, it's a portrayal in a movie, but how much that alone, I feel like, boosted her up into trying something and understanding. Other websites, I can share more information for what you're asking for. A lot of my so the advocacy I've been working on is largely international education focused, which is part of why Connecting Our World is like the most amazing resource for me. When I looked at the NASPA resource, because I'm not as involved with NASPA, it was slightly more challenging for me to know how to get involved with that. But I would say both of those websites, and I can share those out when I email to people, and I'll look for some more. So thank you for that. Any other questions? Well, it looks like that was our main question today. So thank you all for taking time to be with me on this webinar. I really appreciate it. And Morgan, and to the rest of you, I will send out some more information, what I have at least. I would say advocacy is something that I work at every day, and I would say I have not met any experts that I know, but I know I've met a lot of people like myself with a lot of passion, and we do everything we can pretty much every day. So anyway, thank you for taking time. I hope you have a great rest of your day.